Hello, welcome to Talking Europe on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson, and this week we are at the European Commission meeting Justice Commissioner Didier Reynders. Now, that job puts him in charge of, among many other things, one of the most diplomatically thorny issues within the European Union at the moment: member states' respect for rule of law. Now this, as rule of law degradations are flagged up in Poland, Hungary and Romania particularly. Up until last November, Didier Reynders was Foreign and Defence Minister for his home country of Belgium, a country that has been under a caretaker government since inconclusive elections 9 months ago and a government collapse a few months before that. So Didier Reynders, plenty to talk about. Thanks for being our guest on Talking Europe.
My pleasure.
I'd like to start actually first off with some headlines from the last couple of days. Brexit really coming back onto the agenda. We've got the British government has now presented its negotiating mandate, the Commission a few days before that. One thing that stood out in relation to your justice portfolio, the UK government wants to quit the European Court of Justice and it seems also the European arrest warrant system. And it's not clear, particularly on the arrest warrants, what other arrangements would replace that. Now, do you see this as a threat to European security and justice?
But first of all, it's the beginning of a negotiation process, and so we'll have some months with difficult moments, and it's a difficult moment now with some declarations in London. But
perhaps not a good start.
Well, not a good start, but it's all the time the same. When you start negotiations, you have very strong position, maybe on both sides. On the side of the European Union, we have tried to work in the same way than before. We have a full confidence in Michel Barnier with a task force, and we'll work all together with Michel Barnier with a real comprehensive approach. So not justice in some discussions and then others. No, it will be a part of a global picture. And at the end, we will see if it's possible to have a balanced agreement. Of course, we are in favour of a real positive agreement for both UK and the continent and the European Union. If it's not possible, we will be ready to organise something else. But it's the beginning of a negotiation process, and so I'm not surprised by so hard declarations in London in the last hours.
Well, the UK government has also said that it's considering whether to just walk away from the talks in June and essentially prepare for another no-deal exit at the end of the transition period. Do you take that seriously, or do you think it's more of a bluff?
Of course, we need to take that seriously, but I've said it's the beginning of the negotiation. It was my reference to the last declarations. Last year, it was quite the same. We have had very strong declarations before, at the end, a correct agreement or the withdrawal agreement. And so it's possible to have a smooth process during the transition year. We will see if it's possible to do the same. I'm hoping that it will be the case, that we will have a good agreement to organise the relations between the UK and the European Union for the future. But you know that the main issue will be the trade agreement. And on such a base, it will be possible to discuss on all the different other issues.
All right, well, we'll stay with some recent news, but this time from your home country, here in Belgium. Belgium's been in the headlines worldwide over the last few days over an historic carnival that's just been accused of harbouring anti-Semitism. It took place in Aalst, which is just about 30 kilometres up the road from where we are right now in Brussels. Take a look at this report. It's by Mathilde Benezet and Luc Brown.
This is the Aalst carnival in Belgium. Costumes, floats, fun and laughter, and accusations of anti-Semitism. At the heart of the scandal, this float depicting the Western Wall, followed by locals dressed as Orthodox Jews with the bodies of ants. A caricature too far for many, including human rights groups and public figures such as French MEP Raphael Glucksmann.
Jews are vermin. Vermin with loads of money who control the world, no less. And the Nazis are nice guys who children applaud and with whom we want to go for a beer. Welcome to the Aalst Carnival in 2020, in Belgium, heart of the EU. Degenerates.
Jews were not the only identifiable group caricatured in the parade. Boris Johnson and even Australian koalas also featured. The townspeople of Aalst defend their right to poke fun at everything, saying the carnival has taken this stance for 600 years.
Not very well explained in a way that the message didn't come across as we're not anti-Semitic people, we didn't want to hurt you. We just wanted to make fun of ourselves.
It seems to me that Jews must be lacking in their sense of humor and always feeling like they're victims in every situation.
This isn't the first time the carnival has been cause for controversy. In 2019, Orthodox Jews with hooked noses were featured sitting on cases of gold and silver. That prompted the UN's cultural body UNESCO to take the carnival off the list of World Cultural Heritage. Local police have been working to identify the people involved with the floats accused of anti-Semitism. And Belgium's Prime Minister, Sophie Wilmès, has asked legal institutions to investigate whether any laws have been broken.
Well, Didier Reynders, there's been plenty of reaction to the images we just saw there in the Aalst carnival. A Commission spokesperson a couple of days ago said it should be self-evident that images like these should not parade the European streets 75 years after the Holocaust. And the caretaker Prime Minister here in Belgium said that Belgian legal institutions would have to look into whether the law was broken. Should Belgian authorities perhaps just make things clear and specifically ban this kind of anti-Semitic caricature?
The condemnation from the Commission was very clear. And I support fully such a condemnation, because it's not just a legal issue. Of course, it will be the responsibility of the Court of Justice to say something about a legal condemnation, but it's more than that. At the Commission level, we have asked sometimes to have action plans in all the member states to fight against anti-Semitism. Why? There's a real growth of anti-Semitism in all the member states since some years, and we have seen that in the last years. And so it's a real task for the national authorities to try to show that it's possible to fight very concretely against that. And so it's true that it's needed to have a real discussion with the local authorities of Aalst in such a city to see if it's possible to change the way to organize such an event. It's normal to have a caricature about the politicians, about many other things, but when you are going to racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, it's too far. And it's not just a legal issue.
Would you support a ban on that kind of caricature?
But ban such a kind of caricature, certainly, and to discuss, to organize in another way such a carnival, and not to open the door for a real orientation to racism, xenophobia and anti-Semitism. And this is the reason why it was a very clear condemnation from the Commission, and I'm hoping also from the national authorities in Belgium.
On a related issue, I mean, this was a carnival out in the streets, but when you go online, racist, anti-Semitic sentiment, incitement to all kinds of hate crimes, even the shootings and attacks we've seen in Germany appear to have been incited online recently. Big platforms like Facebook signed up to a code of conduct a few years ago, but it's voluntary, it's seen as a weak measure by many. Is it time for firmer legislation in the online space?
I'm quite sure that it will be needed to do that. Of course, it was a clear vision with the former Commission to organize some pledges, some voluntary actions from the different platforms. But there are two reasons to do more. There is a lack of efficiency for the moment, and we have seen that, so we need to do more. But also we need to do more with all the platforms, because there are some pledges from different platforms, the big one, but for the rest, we have other platforms without the same kind of commitment. And so it's very important to show that we have the same regulation for all the different platforms. But such a regulation, that doesn't mean that it's no responsibility for the platform themselves. It's not because you have a law that it's impossible to go further than that or forward than that. And so we'll continue to discuss with the main platforms online to be sure that it's possible to have a level playing field, in fact, and maybe to impose some sanctions. If you have frequently the same kind of problem with one platform, it must be possible to take sanctions.
All right, well, let's look at news here in Belgium. As I mentioned in the introduction to the programme, your country has been without a formal government. There's been a caretaker government for many months now. Does Belgium just need new elections at this point?
That will be the choice of the parliament, because in Belgium it's in the hand of the parliament to decide to go back to the voters and to go back to elections.
But how long can the country carry on without full, effective government?
There's no rule except that it's a decision of the parliament, so it's in the hands of the parliament. But now there's a sort of sense of urgency growing in Belgium. Maybe due also to the crisis that we have now with the coronavirus, the COVID-19, because if you look to the figures in the stock exchange, but maybe the repercussions in the real economy, it will be needed to have a real government with a majority in the parliament. Because the problem now is that the actual government has no majority in the parliament. It's quite impossible to vote a budget or to vote different kind of reforms of maybe urgent measures if it's needed to do that in such a crisis. So I'm hoping that it will be possible to put together around the table different kind of political parties. The difficulty in Belgium is that we are working, of course, with a proportional system. So you need, at the end, to put together some political parties having different views on different subjects. We don't have a majority system. Of course, it's a choice, but now it's maybe time for the national political parties in Belgium to sit around the table, to have a real government. And it was also the request from the Commission. You have seen the last declaration from some colleagues of the Commission to say we need to have a real government to discuss with him.
So there could perhaps be new elections in Belgium this year?
It's all the time possible, but I'm hoping that it will be possible in next weeks to see some progress in the real capacity to have a new government.
All right, let's come back to your specific portfolio here at the European Commission, those justice issues. I mentioned rule of law. You said in a Belgian newspaper just a few days ago that you feel that there's a rule of law crisis in the European Union. Why, and what do you intend to do about that?
But we have real concerns coming from the Parliament or from the Commission, the former Commission also, about Poland, about Hungary, the independence of the judiciary, to give an example. And so it's very timely to organize new processes, not to replace the actual mechanisms that we have, but to have a real debate about the rule of law. I mean, I will propose to the Commission in September to agree on a report on the rule of law in all the member states without any discrimination. We have started the discussions with the member states on that. We will discuss with all the different stakeholders, NGOs, Council of Europe and other partners, and our own Agency for Fundamental Rights in Vienna. To do what? To have a real description on the situation in all the member states, independence of the judiciary, the fight against corruption, media pluralism, the check and balances in the constitutional order, and then to discuss in the Council, in the European Parliament, but more than that, in the national parliaments, at the national level, to install a sort of culture of the rule of law. But at the same moment, if it's needed, we'll continue to use the other tools to introduce infringement proceedings to the Court of Justice, or to discuss about the Article 7 in the Council for the next month.
That's the sanctions proceedings that have been instigated against Hungary and Poland in particular. And just looking at those two countries, their governments rather, they've been vehemently pushing back against suggestions that there's degradation of rule of law in their countries, claiming that the Commission is pushing an agenda, wanting to bring in illegal migration into their countries. A Hungarian government minister said this to me in an interview recently. Is this idea of having this survey of the state of rule of law in all member states, is that about trying to stop Hungary and Poland from saying that they're being unfairly singled out?
But it's to prove that we don't have any political intention with one of another procedure. We want to work without any discrimination about all the member states. But at the same moment, if it's needed, it's normal that the Commission is going to the court. And at the end, it's the task of the Court of Justice to take a decision. And we have seen in the last months that it was possible for the Court of Justice to take very positive decisions in the line of the rule of law in Poland or in Hungary. So we'll work with all the tools at our disposal. But the new tool, the new annual report on the rule of law that we are working on with all the members of the Commission, is to have a real debate at the national level at the end of the process. And every year, like we have had since many years now, about the budgetary situation. You know that we have a real discussion on the budget in the national parliaments all the time. We need to do the same about the values.
In terms of looking at all the member states, that could then potentially open up other member states to sanctions or criticism on rule of law. For example, there are questions in France about the state of its prisons. The Council of Europe has been flagging this up for many years. They're the most overcrowded in Europe. There's the highest rate of prison suicides and the most prison breaks from French prisons. Would you envisage that France could potentially have rule of law infringement procedures brought against it?
First of all, it's maybe more a problem of fundamental rights and in line with the Charter. We have a sole report on it. But we'll do the job without any discrimination. But at the end, the goal is not to introduce new infringement proceedings. Of course, if it's needed, we'll do that. But it's more to convince the different member states to change the situation, to modify the situation, sometimes with new regulations, sometimes in the prisons in many member states, I must say, maybe with new investment in the prisons. And that is very important. If we want to organize a correct application, of course, you need to be sure that you are sending some people to another member state where it's possible to have a correct situation in the prisons. So the goal of the report will be to improve the situation and not just to start new infringement proceedings.
Well, in terms of where infringements of rule of law, serious infringements, are identified, there is a serious discussion at the moment about the idea of making certain EU funds conditional upon respect of rule of law. This is a European Commission policy. Now, when I interviewed the Hungarian foreign minister back in January, he said to me, European cohesion funds have nothing to do with political and subjective issues, in response to a question about rule of law. What's your response to that?
No, it's a protection of the European budget. We will install a new prosecutor office at the European level to take care of it. And so we'll organize a real process about the use of the European funds in the different member states. Unfortunately, it was impossible for Hungary, for Poland and some others to take part. So if you don't take part in such a process, we need to have other tools. And the best tool is to explain that if there is a real breach of the rule of law, it's quite impossible to send European funds without any limits. And so it's possible to suspend or to take other decisions. It's a proposal from the Commission. It's quite new. It's really new. So for the moment, we have discussions at the Council level on it. I'm hoping that we will move on it. We will prove that it's possible, like it was the case in the past for the budgetary situation, to make some progresses. Of course, we'll continue to ask to have a real conditionality between the European funding to different policies in the member states and a full respect for the rule of law. Of course, if it's the case of a real breach, that we will use that, and it's more a pressure than just an intention to use.
Well, you mentioned the European Public Prosecutor's Office, this new body that's in the process of being set up. 22 out of the 27 European member states only have signed up to this. It is a voluntary sign-up. Can this really be an effective body while, A, it's voluntary and not everybody joins in with it?
Yes, it's voluntary, but when you are in, of course, it's the task of the chief prosecutor and the college to do the job. So it will be without any limitations coming from the member state taking part. But for the 22, it's a real step forward. And I will try to have all the different elements to start this year, so in November, the functioning of this EPPO, the new prosecutor office. And of course, we have maybe had an evaluation some years ago, in 2017, with some figures. Now we have new evaluation about the number of cases coming from the member states, and we need to have a higher budget. So I'm in discussion with the Commissioner in charge for budget, Mr. Aalst, and we are looking together to see if it's possible to deliver.
All right, Didier Reynders, we have run out of time, but thank you so much for speaking to us on
next
France
time.
24. Thank you. And thanks to you for watching as well. Do stay with us for part 2 of the programme coming up in just a couple of minutes' time.
Special events.
I'm Melissa Caberly, updating you on the polls from Texas. We'll find out which Democratic candidate comes out on top in this predominantly red state.
Join us on France 24 for all the results on Super Tuesday.